Today, on this week's edition of On the Line, our soon-to-be weekly interview show, Liberal MP Anthony Housefather joins me, Jen Gerson. Housefather has been one of the most outspoken critics of the Liberals on Israel. Today, we discuss his reaction to an NDP motion that he believes was anti-Israel, and what that means for him in the Liberal Party caucus. So thank you for coming on to this week's edition of On the Line. With us, we have Anthony Housefather. Anthony, tell us a little bit about who you are for people in our audience who may not be familiar with you.
Native Montrealer, born and bred. I did my law degree at McGill, my MBA at Concordia. I worked in a multinational technology company as the general counsel and executive vice president, corporate affairs, for most of my career, and was elected federally in 2015. Before that, I was also, while I was working at my company, was also the mayor of the city of Côte-Saint-Luc, which is the largest city in my riding for 10 years.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit, why did you decide to make that pivot from business over into politics?
Well, because there was a chance, there was an opening. Erwin Kotler, who was our previous member from my riding, was retiring in 2015. And I realized that even if I was enjoying where I was at the time, if somebody else my age were to win the nomination in the riding, they could be there for 30 or 40 years, and I would never have a chance to run. So I said, well, you only regret what you don't do. You don't regret what you do, and I did it.
And of course, if you did win the nomination, you'd almost be certainly secure in a seat for life. Is that about right to assume?
Well, I mean, in 2011, Erwin only won the riding by 6 points.
Mm-hmm.
And so in 2015, I broadened it to 13, in 2019, 34, and in 2021, 36. So I don't know that it was necessarily the safest seat in 2015 because, Erwin only won by 6 points in 2011. It went down from, I think he won 92% of the vote in his first election in 1998 or 99, and was down to 41% by 2011. So I think at least in my first election, Stephen Harper started the campaign for the Conservatives in Mount Royal.
Mm-hmm.
They were really hoping to pick up the seat, and I had a very, very tough battle to beat Robert Libman, who was my opponent.
Okay. So tell me, then why did you decide to go with the Liberal Party?
So, like most English-speaking Montrealers, our families for generations have been liberal.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Liberal Party was the party that we perceived as the one that stood strong against Quebec separation, the party that would defend minority language rights, including English rights in Quebec, and defend minorities. So for English-speaking Montrealers, for a very long time, we've been almost single-issue voters in the sense that regardless of our economic interests or what we think about other things, we vote for the party that protects us on a daily basis in what we most fear.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you're a Jewish individual as well, so I think that plays into you want to focus on a party that you perceive to be more protective of minority rights.
I mean, yes, although to be honest, for most of my life, and even for most of my parents' lives, the issue of being Jewish was never a big deal. Like, I never felt any anti-Semitism growing up. I never felt any anti-Semitism until I was a federal member of parliament. So while, of course, I always wanted to protect the Jewish community, it was never a very big issue for me. I always felt insecure and threatened as an English-speaking Quebecer, but I never felt threatened as a Jew. And that's something that's really evolved since 2015, 2016, and now is probably the biggest issue.
Right. Interesting. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about what it's been like in politics since 2015. Obviously, you've been in government for that very long time. What was that transition like going into a government as a member of the government caucus?
So I'd never been an MP before. I was leaving 2 jobs that I really loved. I
Mm-hmm.
loved being, at the company as an executive at the company, and I loved being a mayor. And of course, you take a big salary cut, and you head to Ottawa, and you figure out how to move around, how to help your constituents, which I really knew already as a mayor. So the idea of constituent service, helping people get grants, answering questions on a daily basis from constituents, providing good customer service in my office, that I already knew how to do.
Hmm.
How to legislate was different. It was the first time I served on committees. I was elected to chair the Justice and Human Rights Committee. Nearly immediately, we had the medically assisted dying legislation that was put forward after the Carter judgment of the Supreme Court, which said that certain individuals had a right to have medically assisted suicide or medically assisted death. And that was a very complicated legislation that required, you know, like many hundreds of hours in terms of witnesses and clause by clause. And you sort of got your feet wet. And for the next 4 years, I served on that committee. In 2019, I was reelected and I was parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Labor. In 2021 was reelected and became parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement. And then I got dumped last year after having voted against the government's official languages bill because I believed it didn't protect the rights of the English-speaking minority in Quebec.
Hmm.
And then I was reappointed this January as parliamentary secretary to the president of the Treasury Board. And that's sort of been my parliamentary career, being on committees, being a parliamentary secretary, and of course, you have caucus where you fight in caucus for your positions and advocate.
So it kind of sounds like you've always been willing to be outside of the circle of popularity that we all know exists within a caucus.
I mean, I believe that my job and my principal job is to fight for the rights of my constituents, and to make sure that they are my priority. And when government legislation or government action harms my constituents that I raise it in caucus, I do my best to fight and change it. And if not, I'll be public about the fact that I don't agree and what I think should be done. And
And how
yeah,
does and how does the caucus respond to that? Because I mean, we know that we're in an era of highly centralized power, and we know that we're in an era of highly whipped caucuses. And it's not very normal for any MP, backbench parliamentary secretary, or cabinet minister to step outside of a government line. So what's it like from the inside when you do that?
so I have a lot of great friendships in caucus. I have a lot of friends there, and I think I get along very well with everybody. But yes, I am, I guess, a maverick in that sense. I'm not quite Nate Erskine-Smith, but I'm not far away in terms of believing that the centralized power should not be centralized, that members of parliament should be much more like members of Congress in the United States, able to speak their mind, able to vote how they want on the vast majority of votes other than confidence votes, and that there's nothing bad in our system when that happens. In fact, I think it's a positive.
Do you
I
get
think
find
we
that you
would be, but
get punishment or you get pushback or you deal with caucus cultural or social issues when you step outside that particular box?
well, I mean, I did lose my parliamentary secretaryship last year.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, certainly there are people who may grumble that, believe that everybody in caucus should say exactly the same thing all the time and that you're like a hockey team. Um, I don't really believe that. I think you're certainly a team, but that doesn't mean that in politics, one riding is the same as the other, or one person's views is the same as the other. And you're elected to represent your riding and your values and your views, and they're not necessarily going to coincide with everybody in your party. And if people believe that parties are monoliths, then yeah, you should vote for a party, not a person. But if we have in our system the concept that you vote for a person in your riding, not a party, which is what I think it should be, then that person is obliged to represent the riding. And if people voted that way, right? If people voted for the representative, like they do in the United States historically, for the person, is the person representing me, not the party, and they take into context how that person votes and how that person speaks, not what the party leader does and what the party as a whole does, I think we'd have a better system and many more MPs that would speak out on a much wider variety of issues, much more for their constituents.
Now, I know that this conversation leads us right into October 7th, and of course, what's happened in recent weeks. But before we go into there, I want to ask you a little bit about prior to October 7th. Have you found that serving in government has changed over that time, or do you find that it's very much the same kind of caucus, the same kind of social cohesion that you had at the beginning in 2015?
I don't think that the caucus itself is different.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the perspective of the liberal caucus on the Middle East is different.
Mm.
As the majority, I think the caucus today is far less pro-Israel than it was in 2015 to 2019.
Mm-hmm.
But the being in caucus, the you know the I don't think is very much different. I think the caucus is pretty similar in terms of how we handle caucus.
Mm-hmm. Of course, we know that the liberals are not as popular as once they were. I don't think that's a mystery at this point, and Justin Trudeau personally is not as popular as he was, lo those many years ago. Do you think that that decline in popularity has been something that the caucus takes on board or is concerned about, or is that something that they just look through and say, well, end of the mandate or part of the cycle or a couple years to the next election, like just carry on kind of thing?
I don't know. I mean, I can't speculate on what the caucus as a whole does or does not think because I think different individuals in the caucus will have their own perspectives on everything. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
there's unanimity in the caucus. I think everybody can take, the polls into account and I think that there would be no member of caucus that isn't aware of where the Liberal Party is in the polls and what the Prime Minister's personal numbers are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that's clear.
Do you think that there's been ever an issue in your experience that has divided the caucus as much as what's happening with Israel right now? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't mean to be, I don't want you
Yeah.
to tell tales out of school,
No.
but I think it's pretty obvious that there's a divide on this issue and it's a pretty intense one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only two, times previously where I think that there was divisions such as this were, on the fiscal reforms,
Mm-hmm.
that dealt with small businesses and professionals a few years ago. There was because those were public. I mean, I'm only going to talk about what's public, right?
Sure,
There
yeah.
was certainly divisions in the Quebec caucus about the Official Languages Act reforms,
Mm-hmm.
where the English-speaking MPs from Quebec didn't agree with these reforms the way others did. But this is a whole new level of proportion in terms of disagreement between caucus and very public ones.
Is it a more of an emotional tone to the disagreement than it has been in times past?
The Official Languages Act was emotional.
Okay,
I mean, because again, it's how you deal with language as a minority language person,
right.
and your community. So it's somewhat similar, but definitely this one is probably tinged with even more emotion.
Yeah, okay. So that's interesting, and I want to get into that. But first, I want to talk about what has changed since October 7th. To some extent, I just want to do a vibe check. Have you noticed that there has been a significant change in the way the caucus functions, the way the caucus treats you, the vibes, the cohesion, anything like that? What's shifted since the Hamas attack in on Israel?
I think what's shifted the most is the perspective that comes from caucus on the Israel-Gaza situation.
Hmm.
I think in the first month after the attacks, there was a general, from most people, understanding that Israel was attacked and had the right to respond. And I think that was the position the government articulated for about a month or a bit more, until December probably. But then you've had a number of occasions since then where I've bitterly disagreed with what the government has done, whether on the UN vote in December, where it voted for a ceasefire with no conditions, which contradicted our public position,
Hmm.
whether its inability to articulate that Israel's not committing genocide in January, whether it's stopping funding UNRWA and then funding UNRWA again with no payment due for another month
Hmm.
and no report from the UN to substantiate whether or not the allegations that we stopped funding UNRWA for were valid. Um, and now, even worse, the vote on the NDP motion last week, where, in my view, the NDP original motion was a plainly anti-Israel motion that, in many respects, put Israel, a democratic state, on par with Hamas, a terrorist organization. And as opposed to just voting it down, the government sought to amend it.
Okay, so I'm going to get into the resolution because I kind of want to go in there point by point here. But there's something that you said earlier that kind of tweaked me, and that was you think that the federal liberals were more or less on board with the state of Israel between 2015 to 2019, not
No, 20,
2023.
no, 20, so the government,
Yeah.
2015 to 2023, we had the best record of any government on votes at the UN related to Israel.
Hmm.
We have voted against anti-Israel resolutions at the UN more than Harper did. They voted against anti-Israel stuff 62% of the time
Hmm.
during his tenure as prime minister. We were in the 80s.
Hmm.
Um, and, and I think on record related to the Jewish community in Israel, we were very good, very, very good. Whether that, adopting the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, appointing a special envoy for Holocaust remembrance and to combat anti-Semitism, apologizing for the St. Louis and the refugee record in the 1930s, having a summit on anti-Semitism in 2021. We were good on this issue until the Hamas attacks.
So that's kind of
And then,
ironic that Hamas attacks Israel, and that fundamentally shifts some preconceived positions around support for Israel.
right. Well, I mean, so what I mentioned in 2019, that was the caucus. So the caucus has
Uh,
since, the government's been good.
oh, the
The
government's been good.
caucus,
Sorry, I apologize
yeah,
then. Okay,
the
misunderstood.
caucus on Israel, I first noticed, in the 2021 period, had many more people that were willing to take an anti-Israel position.
So this is something
And
that's been fermenting in the background for some time prior to the October
yeah,
7th attack. Okay.
yes, yes. And after that, after about a month, starting about a month after the attacks, we had a letter sent by Liberal MPs, including a number of parliamentary secretaries, signed by Liberal and NDP MPs, asking the government to demand a permanent ceasefire, um, and more MPs, making demands of Israel that I think were not fair.
But what do you think changed the caucus on this prior to the attacks, sort of in that 2019 to 2023 period? What was shifting?
Well, different people were elected. Um,
Okay. Well, fair
new
enough. Yes, more people were
new
elected in
people were
2021.
right. New people were added in. Colleagues of mine like Michael Levitt or Wayne Easter or others that were pro-Israel left.
Hmm.
There were changes in the caucus composition, particularly among the people that were the most vocal on the issue.
Hmm. Okay, and so
And
that shifted the center of gravity in caucus on some of this stuff.
I believe so. I,
Okay.
I believe so. And I think also the 2021 skirmishes and of course the visuals of what's happened in Gaza and the civilian tragedy in Gaza,
Hmm.
have for people who are not well educated on the long history of the region, it certainly creates emotion, on the side of protecting civilians and without understanding the reasons that Israel feels it needs to eradicate Hamas, a terrorist organization that in its own charter calls for the obliteration of Israel and also attacks on Jews throughout the world.
I mean, you're
So,
also seeing those visuals as well. How do you reconcile those images with your position and support for Israel?
well, I think because Israel shouldn't be treated differently than every other country, right? Bashar al-Assad murdered like 500,000 of his own countrymen, barely heard about it.
Hmm.
Israel is responding to a terrorist attack, and I viewed the sites in Israel where this attack occurred. I'm aware of what people's stories are when they were hiding in their safe room for 24 hours and saw family members and friends drop off their WhatsApp chat groups because they were being burned to death in their homes or tortured and then murdered barbarically or raped or kidnapped. And I understand that for Israelis, whether they're on the center, the left, or the right, I don't like the Netanyahu government. I wouldn't vote for them. I abhor the far right people that he's aligned himself with, like Smotrich and Ben Gvir.
Hmm.
But I do understand that whatever their political perspective, Israelis really believe that if they don't get rid of Hamas, they will have another pogrom next week, next month, or next year. And the Hamas leaders say that. They say it openly. So Hamas, who builds tunnels under schools, under infrastructure, under hospitals, and and literally takes money that we send for foreign aid and uses it to build up their terrorist infrastructure, buttressed by Iran, sending them, missiles. Well, they're the ones largely responsible for the civilian casualties in Gaza because you can't even fight them without killing civilians. So while I hope Israel would be more careful, I would wish Israel would do everything it can to protect civilians. I also understand that in Israel's fight, it's Hamas that should be the primary responsibility because they could end the war tomorrow by releasing the hostages and surrendering, and they don't. And they could stop building their infrastructure under civilian locations. So,
Three questions I want to come out of that. One is
sure.
that one of the big concerns that I think a lot of people have, again, we're very lucky to be able to look at this stuff from a distance and be able to look at this stuff from thousands of kilometers away, right? But I think one of the big concerns that people have is A, whether or not Israel is doing enough to minimize civilian casualties, B, whether or not you have a leader right now in Benjamin Netanyahu who would almost certainly be facing jail time if he were removed from office and would be forced to deal with serious corruption charges. And so you have a lot of these really perverse incentives aligning for someone like Netanyahu to prolong the war as long as possible, to keep his own butt out of jail on corruption charges, and also to go as absolutely ruthlessly as possible for a lot of different reasons, not least of which because Israel is potentially losing so much public support in the general world writ large. The incentive is for him to go as brutal as possible, as fast as possible, and to be as effective as possible at eliminating his target in order to, I don't know, get the Israeli population to come back on side with him. So it just sort of seems like it's a bit of a nightmare scenario in every direction. And I just wonder, where's the value in you as a Canadian advocating for any of this?
Well, I mean, I wasn't the one that put the motion in front of Parliament, right?
No, no,
I
that's
mean,
fine. That's fine.
you
But
know, like
I'm
I
going to get to
mean,
the motion because I think that
yeah,
that's worth discussing in more depth. But
yeah. I
like,
mean,
what's the value for you in standing up for Israel as it's being accused in some quarters of genocide, which would be very spectacular, but accused in other quarters of certainly engaging in overt brutality or even war crimes in others. I mean,
well, because I don't believe it to be true.
you don't believe it to be true.
I believe that there's a double standard being applied to Israel that's not applied to other countries. I believe part of it exists because of anti-Semitism.
Hmm.
I believe that I believe that there is a need for people to defend Israel, not to defend Netanyahu, not to defend his government. Although I would note that now there's a coalition, right? There's a coalition government related to the war, and Benny Gantz, for example, who's very much a centrist, is the second biggest figure in the war cabinet, and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister. These are not right-wing extremists.
Hmm.
The issues of Netanyahu and the people that he surrounds himself with are different. I mean, I think we would all hope that Israelis would elect somebody else. But that doesn't mean that because we don't like the leader and we don't like some of the people in his cabinet, that the Israeli military, which is a very well-trained organization, one that has, I believe, a lot of legal, observation and supervision in terms of what they do, um, should be accused of war crimes. I think again, there's limits as to the language that we should be using, whether we think they're being too aggressive and they're killing too many civilians because they're not carefully aiming at Hamas, or they're deciding to aim at Hamas knowing they're going to kill X number of civilians. That's a fair criticism. Debate can be had, but they're not seeking to eliminate the Palestinian population. The Palestinian population has grown, over the last years, quite a lot. So, and if Israel really wanted to, right, Israel has the military capacity to wipe out everybody. I mean, Israel's not doing that. They're seeking, whether you think they're causing too many casualties or not, they're seeking to eradicate Hamas.
So would
And
there
and
be
and
a point at which some Israel could do something for you that would be so over the line that you would say, I can't lend my support to the state or to the continued war as it is? Would there be a line that they could cross where you would just be like, no, I can't get behind that?
well, I don't agree with everything that Israel does. I didn't agree with Netanyahu's judicial reforms last year.
Hmm.
I don't necessarily agree that I don't believe they should attack Rafah. Like
Hmm.
there's many things that I don't agree with, and I would say them, and I say them all the time when I don't agree with something that Israel does. But it doesn't mean I don't agree with the state, or I'll ever withdraw my support for the state of Israel and its
Hmm.
people, which is not the government.
So what do you do when you make these arguments in caucus? And I'm presuming you do make these arguments in caucus. How does caucus respond to that?
Well, there's many different opinions in caucus, right?
Yeah.
I mean, eh, my job is to advocate for the position that I have and my lived experience as a member of the Jewish community and my understanding of the state of Israel. And the president of the Canada-Israel Friendship Group. I've been to Israel many, many times. You know, as an athlete, in my old work at my company, and as an MP now a few times. And I have a much better understanding of Israeli society and the Israeli government than the vast majority of my colleagues do. And to me, the only way that we would influence Israel is by working with the United States to do so, because the United States is the only country, based on the amount of aid that the United States gives Israel, the incredible importance of US support for Israel, that has any ability to influence the Israeli government. And so, as opposed to taking our own positions that mean nothing other than drawing the ire of the Israeli government and making them listen to us less, the real the real influence would have been working hand in hand with the United States and influencing the American position, and then agreeing to adopt exactly the same position as the United States.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, we are recording this on Monday, and the UN has just passed a ceasefire resolution. We can talk about the actual wording of the ceasefire resolution because it was a conditional ceasefire resolution. I believe it was intended, required Hamas to release all the hostages, for example. But I think it was also very noticeable in this case that, the United States abstained from voting against it, and this is why it passed. And this I think is significant in the sense that it's not necessarily going to bring an end to the war or influence Israel's actions here, but it does indicate a real waning of public support in the world at large, and most importantly within the United States. Does that change, or ought that to change, Canada's position or metrics, given what you've just said in terms of the way that we should be aligning ourselves with the United States to maximize our influence here?
Well, I mean, again, we should be in lockstep with the United States. The issue is, first of all, for the United States, they were vast. The record of Blinken and Biden has been, and the congressional Democrats, has been vastly more supportive of Israel than Canada has been over the
Hmm.
last number of months. Even where they are now, though, their position is entirely different than ours. Um, yes, the United States, just like everybody in the world, is getting frustrated with Netanyahu's failure to listen to the advice that they're giving him, whether Biden, whether Blinken, whether Schumer, etc. And the United States, and you see that frustration and that exasperation. And again, if Canada's position would be tied to that in the United States, I think the vast majority of Canadian Jews would be supporting the government. We don't like Netanyahu any more than they do.
Hmm.
But it's not what Canada's position is. For example, the United States is selling arms to Israel. Canada's new position is not to ship even non-lethal weapons to Israel, which, if everybody took that position, then Iran would arm Hamas and Hezbollah, that send hundreds of missiles a day onto Israel. And if the Iron Dome wasn't there, you'd have thousands of Israelis killed too, in the same way you have people killed in Gaza.
Hmm.
And Israel wouldn't be able to defend itself. So Canada's position, has been just completely off the United States.
It seems like to me like Canada's positions, this is a terrible expression, but we're trying to suck and blow at the same time. It seems like we're trying to constantly appease two polarized and completely diametrically opposed constituencies. And with these kind of mealy mouth positions or half walk back positions on any number of the issues that you've already stated. I mean, is that a fair perception?
I think the prime minister, I'm sure, would tell you that's not the case.
Hmm.
But I could certainly see why people would see that.
So,
I certainly feel that the principled support for Israel that I've seen from the United States, Israel is a democratic country, Israel is a Western ally, Hamas is a proxy for Iran, Hezbollah is a proxy for Iran, they're fomenting terrorism in the Middle East. And the lack of support that has been shown to Israel since November by the Canadian government, to me, is disappointing. And that was not the platform that I believe that I was elected on.
so I want to get into the question of motivation given what you just said, which I believe to be true, and that is Canada has relatively little role to play in any of the outcomes here, good or bad. I think that there's an element of grandiosity when Canadians try to dip their toes into foreign affairs and foreign politics right now. And if I'm looking at this as someone who's maybe a little politically engaged, but not super politically engaged, I really do wonder why so much of federal politics is getting consumed by a foreign war that bluntly we don't have much control over. We don't have much say one way or the other. Israel's not listening to our motions on whether or not to respect Palestine or some version of Palestine. Like, we don't have any say here, and the kinds of roles that we could potentially play are mostly limited humanitarian roles and also roles of sort of symbolic funding. I mean, we're not big players in the world anymore, and particularly not when it comes to the Middle East. And that's been the result of many successive governments' choices in the way that we've chosen to prioritize our funding and our time and our energy. So to some extent, it's a bit bizarre to watch what's happening in Ottawa from this NDP motion, which we're about to get into, and just to, I don't know, try and comprehend the degree of emotion and grandiosity that is going into this particular issue and how divorced it feels from where Canadians are actually at and the things that they're focused on. Because, like I said earlier, we do have this luxury of being thousands of kilometers away, and we do have the luxury of being focused on things like house prices and whether or not I can pay my groceries. And most Canadians, I also think, are pretty sensible, and they understand that our decision to support a ceasefire motion or not, the motion that we pass about supporting a two-state solution or not, is not really going to have much of a difference one way or the other to what's happening in the Middle East. So I have to ask, given that's all true, what is motivating the people who are choosing to make this the forefront of their political calculus, the forefront of their political issue? I could include you in all of that, but I mean, Heather McPherson from the NDP is the one who put forward this motion that we're going to talk about. What's motivating her and her caucus? What's motivating the people within the Liberal caucus to spend so much time and political capital on an issue that bluntly has very little effect for the majority of Canadians?
I, I think that what's happened is that there are Canadians who, care deeply about the region because of their own personal histories. And I mean, I would say the Jewish community certainly has that attachment to Israel. Muslim Canadians seem to be very much determined to prioritize the Gaza issue. And I think there's a whole group on the left that seized onto Gaza as a cause with,
Mm-hmm.
with very little understanding of the Jewish people's indigeneity to Israel. They've created an anti-Zionist narrative that makes Zionism into some racist ideology, as opposed to the ideology that Jews deserve one national homeland in Israel, as created by the United Nations in 1947 by the partition of Palestine, and completely unaware that Israel was attacked by Arab states in 1947, in 1956, in 1967, in 1973. And to be honest, it's a lack of understanding of the history that's allowed more and more people to latch on to the cause. And I think Jewish Canadians are reacting in a way, in a very emotional way, to the way these demonstrations for Palestine are occurring.
Mm-hmm.
Where they're surrounding our buildings, they're surrounding our businesses. There's blatant anti-Semitism coming out in a lot of the chants, and Jewish Canadians have understandably become very emotional about this. And so I don't think there's anything more important to the Jewish community than the anti-Semitism that's happening domestically in Canada. I think it's not Israel. Israel's part of it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the anti-Semitism happening in Canada because of the issue of Israel, that has caused Jewish Canadians to be incredibly angry about the motion being adopted, with the Liberals' support by this amendment. I think, Jewish Canadians feel truly betrayed.
So it's interesting that emotionality, because I mean, Matt and I at the line have been very clear on our position on this. It's not appropriate or even acceptable to be attacking Jewish community centers, Jewish overpasses, Jewish delis over the act in Canada over the actions of the Netanyahu government in Israel. I think that is a clear and obvious example of anti-Semitism, and I would unequivocally condemn that. And I would also not want to undermine the emotions of people within the Jewish community who are seeing that and having genuine fear responses or genuine anger responses from it. However, I don't think that all acts of protest are necessarily illegitimate either. If you're going to go protest the Israeli embassy, I think that's fair game. I have no issue with that. If you're going to go protest Scotiabank because of their funding to various Israel defense systems, I think that that's fair game. So, and I am also sensitive to the critique of some people who would say, you're just using the term anti-Semitism to delegitimize all protest here. And well, yeah, but some of the protest is anti-Semitic. It's hard to get
Right.
around, right? But there is some nuance here as well. So I mean, I guess the question I would ask is, without wanting to be disrespectful or undermine the fear that I think is genuinely felt in much of the Jewish community, is all of that fear rational and well grounded? Um,
I
or
mean,
is
I
some
don't
of
think you, so go
or
ahead.
is some of that fear potentially an overreaction to a couple of lunatics on an overpass?
So these lunatics were constantly on that overpass
Yeah.
at the 401. I mean, this was not a one-time incident, right? This is a continual practice for months now
Hmm.
where these demonstrators, of course, I agree with you. You can protest at the Israeli embassy, you can protest at a government building.
Hmm.
And if you protest Scotiabank because of this, but you don't protest Scotiabank though because of a number of other things that they're doing that would be, dealing with supporting China, for example,
Hmm.
when you have the Uyghurs, but you
Hmm.
selectively only use Scotiabank protests for, well, I'm not sure about Scotiabank, but at government buildings, fair game. Israeli
Sure.
embassy consulates, fair game.
Sure.
Um, and so number one, there's been a constant practice of targeting Jewish community institutions, causing fear.
Hmm.
Number two, the chants that are being chosen to use from the river to the sea, it means Israel disappears.
Hmm.
Intifada, intifada, to
Yeah.
Jews
What we
signals
really
revolution.
mean is, no, we know what you mean.
Yeah, right. And these are the constant chants. This is not like one person grabbing a microphone and screaming it and everybody else saying, no, 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 shut up. This is these crowds saying this. And I see the crowds in Montreal screaming, house father, you can't hide, you're committing genocide,
Hmm.
right? There, besides my office being vandalized, I'm personally targeted, as are other of my colleagues. So no, that's when they scream House Father, you can hide Ben Dayan, you can't hide, and it's me and Rachel, the only two Jewish MPs, and we're the only one they're chanting about.
Yeah.
There's something very wrong there, very
Yeah.
wrong, and
Yeah.
so it's hard to hide the anti-Semitism that is present in these demonstrations. So yes, the Jewish community, some of them may be too scared or slightly overreacting. I certainly don't believe you should hide your Jewishness or take off a mezuzah from your door or think of leaving Canada.
Hmm.
I mean, I think these are overreactions, but they're people that are very frightened. And I don't want to use anti-Semitism. I don't use the word anti-Semitism lightly. I believe anti-Semitism, too often people are accused of being anti-Semites when they may be ignorant. They're doing things that aren't anti-Semitic. But the idea that these chants are not anti-Semitic, when they scare to death the Jewish community, the chanters know that. And if they were really calling for a ceasefire, they could be screaming ceasefire, ceasefire, Netanyahu, step down, or other things that wouldn't scare Canadian Jews. They're deliberately choosing to use words that terrorize the community.
Yeah. So that is the environment in which I want to bring up this NDP motion. This is a motion that was brought forward, I believe, and you mentioned it on Monday, which would be on March 19th. I believe this was brought forward on Opposition Day, which is a day when the opposition MPs have the opportunity to put forward motions. It was firstly worded in a way that I think was fairly unequivocally pro-Palestine, but it looks like there was a mad dash set of negotiations behind the scenes between the NDP and the Liberal government to try and water down aspects of this motion. I believe that that's accurate, and this I'm summing it up as quickly as I can. So what ultimately was voted on and passed was that the government here in Canada was working towards the establishment of the state of Palestine as part of a negotiated two-state solution. There were other things which I think has actually been established government policy for some time. I think that Canada's been on board with the two-state solution first for I don't know since when, but I don't think that's anything new. And then also there was a call to suspend all trade in military goods with Israel. I think that my colleague Mac pointed out that we don't really have any weapons to trade with Israel, having no essential real capacity there. But if anything, they trade their military weaponry with us, not the other way around. Um, and I think that there were a couple of other items on that motion, including, for example, lifting the cap on temporary applications for Palestinians fleeing Gaza. I think that's an interesting one and probably worth discussing in a little bit of depth. But you responded obviously very negatively to the passing of this motion. Could you just first and foremost give me a sort of a visceral sense of how you responded when this thing passed the House?
Well, sure. I mean, the first thing is this was an anti-Israel motion. It was clear, very clear. It was completely distorting Canadian foreign policy, and the normal government reaction would be to vote it down. You wouldn't negotiate amendments. 99.9% of opposition motions like this are just voted down. I've never seen the government seek to negotiate amendments to that type of an opposition motion ever before.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the normal practice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the negotiations seem to have occurred behind closed doors and involving groups like the National Council for Canadian Muslims and apparently even the fringe independent Jewish voices that doesn't represent more than a tiny fraction of 2% maybe of the Jewish community that were brought in by the NDP. So these groups were seeing the text of these amendments and members of parliament were not. And then the amendments were brought in 10 to 15 minutes before the vote. So you had no time to study these broad, extensive amendments. So the process was horrendous. And while the amendments substantially improved the motion, you still have parts of the motion that I deeply oppose. For example, while Israel purchases very little in terms of non-lethal weapons from Canada, they do purchase in the millions of dollars. There were 43 million, I believe, between October and December of non-lethal weapons from Canada. And it's not coming from the government. All the government does is issue permits for Canadian manufacturers to sell these weapons or non-lethal weapons to Israel.
So what
And what
non-lethal
we've
weapons? What would be an example? Do we know what example of what that
like
would
trucks,
be? Oh,
like
trucks.
parts of
Okay.
trucks that are used for Jeeps, military Jeeps.
Right. Okay.
And there are ones that Israel is waiting for that are waiting on the permits, and now the permits apparently will not be issued. And you're right that Israel sells way more in weapons to Canada than the reverse. And if Israel wanted to do tit for tat and say to Canada, "Hey, sorry, we're blocking all exports to you," we'd be more hurt than they would.
Mm-hmm.
But the lesson is that if we intend that all countries should follow us, Israel would be left defenseless against Hamas and Hezbollah,
On the
that
plus
Iran
side, I don't think
arms.
that there's any scenario where all of the countries would follow Canada for just about anything nowadays. But I mean, so you're
True,
saying that
but this is what Heather McPherson intended, right?
yeah.
Heather McPherson thinks she's lecturing the world in what should be done, and Melanie Joly has just gone along with her. So clearly, Melanie Joly and Heather McPherson believe no weapons should be sold to Israel by anybody.
Mhm.
And frankly, again, if everybody followed this ridiculous lead, Israel would be left defenseless. And we have to understand that, right? If we adopt this in Canada, we have to believe that the intenders of these motions are the whole world should do that. And then, of course, there's the commitment in this motion to support all of the work of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court. And the ICJ is, again, a UN institution that's been highly biased against Israel. So we're changing Canadian foreign policy on the fly. And in this case, my government, the Liberal Party, allowed the NDP to do this.
So you said, I believe the quote here is, "I truly felt last night that a line had been crossed." When we started this podcast, you noted basically item after item of things that the Liberal government had done since the beginning of the year that demonstrated wavering support for Israel. Why was this the line? Why now?
So, I mean, it all leads up to something, but to me, members of parliament rising up to vote on something, that is a much bigger thing than government announcements or a vote at the United Nations.
Hmm.
This is Parliament, the Canadian House of Commons, taking a position. And I had warned, Melanie Joly and the Prime Minister and people in his office 2 weeks before the vote that to me, this was like a red line. This was a huge deal.
And
And
what did they respond when you said that? What did they do?
well, we had exchanges, and I continued to advocate for the fact that the government position should be no. If the government position here had been no, and all of my backbench colleagues had voted for this motion, I wouldn't be upset. Like, I mean, I wouldn't agree with it,
Hmm.
but I wouldn't be upset. What I'm upset about is the government position wasn't just to vote no. And that is not reconcilable for me with what I ran on and what the prime minister said to a synagogue in my riding when he was here in 2015, which is that there would be no daylight between our position and the conservative position on Israel.
Hmm. So I think that reading between the lines of some of the things that you've talked about in public, it seems like you're contemplating your future with the Liberal Party. Is that safe to say?
I'm really trying to reconcile whether or not I belong there. Should I stay and should I be fighting for a centrist position on this and other issues where I disagree? You know, is there still a place for centrists and people who support Israel and people who support, a principled Western-based United States, pro-US, pro-Western foreign policy? Or should I give up and go to another party who may be more in line with me on these issues, but I may not be 100% in line with on domestic issues, for example? And
What are
it's a
some of
very
the,
difficult decision.
I mean, I presume you're talking about the Conservatives, and I really don't think any reason why the Conservatives wouldn't have you, but at the same time, there've got to be issues that you have about aligning yourself with the Conservatives. What, can you give me some
Well,
of your personal conflicts on some of that?
I think what I would just say is, right, like I've never lined up, like most Canadians, right, with any one party on every issue.
Hmm.
And what is a priority for me at one time may change. And there's a lot of times where I would say that domestic issues are far more important to Canadians than foreign policy. Building housing, making sure that everybody can have health care. These are normally the bread and butter issues that people will vote on and are the most important to all Canadians. But this weird conflation of events, which is a mix of domestic and international, the fear of the Jewish community right now and the anti-Semitism could be any community from one time to another. And the inability of all governments to deal with it, in my view, appropriately, is incredibly problematic. And then the lack of, my viewpoint really differing on this foreign policy issue, it's broader than just Israel. It's a Western democracy that we're abandoning to some extent to support the claims of a terrorist organization that is backed by Iran. And if we abandon Israel like this, will we abandon Taiwan? Will we abandon Ukraine? I feel that these are bigger issues than just Israel and just anti-Semitism. And because of what's happened, I'm not immune from being a member of the Jewish community. I don't think out of Canada's 403,000 Jews, there are many of them who believe there's any other issue more important than this right now.
Do you think that what's happening right now is reflective of a deeper, for lack of a better term, more progressive, more left-wing shift that Canada's having on domestic, or sorry, foreign policy more deeply?
I think the views that I would have been, I think, the moderate mainstream views of a Paul Martin government and a Jean Chrétien government, but certainly a Paul Martin government. Um, I feel that right now my views are a distinct minority
Hmm.
in my caucus on foreign policy.
You know,
I
we get this in the line a lot. A lot of people who come to us at the line are actually people who are pretty solidly former left and seem to like our perspective for whatever reason, because they keep on saying things like, well, I didn't change, the left abandoned me. We get a lot of that, right? That kind of mentality. Is that reflective of how you feel with your relationship to the liberals right now?
I was never a leftist. I mean, I don't think I
Fair.
never to me, I've always been a centrist, and I always have seen the Liberal Party as a centrist left party, a center left party,
Hmm.
which is where I've been on the ideological spectrum my whole life. Um, do I believe that there are certain parts of my party that are far to the left of me? Yes, I do. And that's always been the case, but I think now it's a greater percentage and it makes me feel outnumbered. And certainly on this issue, I feel very much isolated. And the vote, where they left three of us to vote against it and then gave a standing ovation to the NDP sponsor, certainly didn't help how I felt about this issue.
It's interesting
So
because I think that it seems to me that there's a political realignment happening, particularly within Jewish communities. Jewish communities, from what my friend Matt has said in Toronto, used to be pretty solid down the line, liberal, center left. And in basically since October, that's realigned, and they've realigned to the conservative side because of the way that they've seen this particular government try to, as I said, weave both ends of the line here. Do you think that your feelings on this are generally representative of where the Montreal community is on this, the Montreal Jewish community is on some of these issues?
yes,
Yeah.
I mean, I think the Jewish community, since the days of Stephen Harper, started swinging to the conservatives. I think that in 2011 was the first time the conservatives won a majority of the Jewish vote in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
In 2015, I think they still won a majority of the Jewish vote in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
In 2019 and 2021, it got more equal. The Liberals regained some of the traction.
Mm-hmm.
But I think since November of 2023, I think other than in my riding and Markham and Dicino's riding, you'd be fairly hard pressed to find a Jewish person that said they wanted to vote for their liberal representative. Maybe Ben Carr's also, but I mean, this is really, they feel very abandoned by our party, and it's very sad to me that this would happen, and I don't know how to explain it to my community. Other than I'm there fighting with them and for them, and they see that, right? They see very visibly with my speech in Parliament and my very public dissent. They understand that I'm there fighting for them, and I just have to see what the best way for me to fight for them is. Is it to make sure, like I've always believed, that you need strong pro-Israel representation from Jews and non-Jews in both parties, that you need strong Jewish voices in both parties to give that Jewish experience, because these two parties will always alternate power. And am I ready to just abandon the Liberal Party, that is the party that's in power 60 to 70% of the time in Canada, because I just can't continue? Well, that's the question. I wish I didn't have to ever come to that question. I never thought I would, but that's the question right now that I'm at. And I
If I'm going to
haven't.
put my sort of my liberal partisan hat on and get on Twitter and put some shamrocks behind my name, um, I would ask, okay, so wait a minute, you guys are seriously considering switching parties to the guys who supported the trucker convoy and paraded around with a swastika flag? Like, doesn't that seem incongruous or impossible to you?
So anti-Semitism exists on both the far right and the far left.
Mm-hmm.
And guilt by association is guilt by association. Um, there were certainly some odd people in the convoy that put up a swastika. I don't see that same link as to voting in the House of Commons for something that is, to me, very, very much anti-Israel. And the anti-Semitism and the Jewish community. Let's put it this way: the convoy. I never got anybody from the Jewish communities that contacted me and said, "I'm really, really scared for my safety or my future in Canada because of those convoys."
Mm.
I get this all the time because of the current demonstrations from the pro-Palestinian side. They're constant, they're scary to Jews. The convoy, yes, I mean, I didn't support the convoy. I thought the convoy blockading downtown Ottawa, blockading bridges, was clearly a huge national problem, but I don't think it was a national problem particularly for Jews versus everybody. This seems to be particularly targeted toward Jews and has created a sense of insecurity in the Jewish community that didn't exist because of the convoy. So I would think that most Jewish Canadians are pretty much resolved that they've forgotten about whatever swastikas existed with the convoy and are much more focused on what's happening now.
Do you think it's been a real wake-up call for a lot of people within the Jewish community, the actions of the last few months?
I think we all thought that anti-Semitism was something from our grandparents and great-grandparents' generation, and while it existed today, it was relatively marginal.
Mm-hmm.
I think now we see that it's not. I think the vast majority of Canadians are not anti-Semitic, but I think there's a very vocal small minority that are, and it's very scary. I know this happens around the world. Canada is one of the best countries in the world when it comes to anti-Semitism, But for Canadian Jews, like American Jews, like Australian Jews, like the three countries where Jews have had the ability to integrate and haven't felt that anti-Semitism that it permeates around Europe, it's been a shock. It's been like European colleagues tell me, well, you should have known that existed. Well, most of us didn't. And most of us are living through a new reality that we never thought would happen. And it's a whole new world, for sure.
Well, on that note, I think that I've definitely been very selfish with your time. So thank you so much for coming and chatting with me. I hope that we can have you on our fledgling show On the Line again soon.